The stifling heat of the summer day hung over the homestead like an oppressive shroud, magnified by the ceaseless chorus of cicadas in the distance. Cora, her hands rough and calloused from relentless toil, moved with purpose among the rows of crops. The rhythmic choreography of her labor provided solace amidst the uncertainty that had gripped their lives. In the distance, her twin brothers reveled in the innocence of youth, their laughter echoing through the sweltering air. But even their carefree antics couldn't entirely dispel the unease that had settled upon the family. It had been a daunting 2 months since their father, Benjamin, had marched off to war, leaving Cora, her mother Martha, and the twins to tend to the homestead. His absence cast a long shadow, a silent worry that lingered like a spectre in the corners of Cora's mind. As Cora paused to wipe the sweat from her brow, her gaze swept over the picturesque scene. The vast expanse of their land seemed like a world unto itself. Amidst the toil and laughter, a figure materialized from the depths of the forest at the edge of their property, emerging like a phantom from the shadows. Cora squinted against the setting sun, recognizing the visitor as Mr. Harrison, a neighboring settler. He waved in a friendly manner, and Martha, Cora's mother, paused in her own labor to offer a warm smile in response. Curiosity piqued, Cora eventually joined them, drawn by the rare opportunity for interaction in this isolated corner of the world. Mr. Harrison inquired about her father, and the shadow of worry darkened Martha's eyes as she spoke of her husband's prolonged absence.
It's been over 2 months since we've received word,
Martha confided, her voice laden with concern and an unspoken fear that hung heavy in the air. Mr. Harrison, shifting uncomfortably where he stood, offered words meant to soothe the uneasy hearts.
War is a treacherous journey, ma'am. But men often return to their families, and we must keep faith, for hope is sometimes the only light in the darkest of times.
As their conversation continued, a foreboding chill settled over the fields, and the sun's warmth waned into an uncertain twilight. Mr. Harrison leaned in, his tone heavy with gravitas, recounting the unsettling tale of a neighboring settler's property ravaged by a local tribe. The shared unease, the offer of refuge, and the unspoken fear of the encroaching darkness pressed upon them like a shroud. With a final nod, Mr. Harrison bid them farewell, his figure receding into the twilight. The twins, their laughter silenced, ran to their mother's side. Cora couldn't shake the growing unease, feeling as if their world was shifting, teetering on the edge of uncertainty. Days passed, marked by palpable tension that hung over the homestead, and the once solace of the woods whispered hauntingly. Cora felt an impending dread, a sense that something loomed in the distance. With each passing day, the burden of unease deepened, like a heavy fog that refused to lift. And though Cora carried on with her daily chores, her eyes often straying to the foreboding forest's edge. But on a fateful afternoon, as Cora dutifully tended to the livestock, her heart betrayed her with an unexpected leap. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that played tricks on her senses. A breeze rustled the leaves, but there was something different in the air, a disquiet that sent shivers down her spine. As she reached down to scoop feed into the chicken's coop, she felt an eerie presence, an inexplicable weight in the atmosphere. It was then that she sensed it, an intruder on the periphery of the field, hidden within the looming shadows that clung to the edge of the homestead like a malevolent cloak. Cora's breath caught in her throat, and her fingers tightened around the scoop of feed as her gaze darted toward the source of her unease. There, standing on the cusp of their land, stood a solitary figure, an Indian man, tall and imposing, with a silhouette that seemed carved from the very darkness itself. His presence struck her like a thunderclap, a chilling spectre that shattered the tranquility they had known for so long. She watched, her heart pounding, as he remained still, a sentinel of the unknown. His features, obscured by the diminishing daylight, were shrouded in an enigmatic veil. The connection between them was electric, like the charged silence before a tempest. Cora's mind raced, grappling with a myriad of emotions: fear, curiosity, and a gnawing sense of vulnerability. Time seemed to stand still as they locked eyes across the distance. In that moment, the weight of their isolation pressed upon her, and the very ground beneath her feet felt unstable. Suddenly, she was a stranger in her own land. Cora's thoughts raced. Her fingers flexed on the scoop, an improvised and inadequate defense against the uncertainty that loomed. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that extended like accusing fingers, Cora couldn't escape the foreboding sensation that their life had irrevocably shifted, plunging her into a foreboding sense of despair. The wooden bucket she held slipped from Cora's grasp, its crash shattering the eerie stillness. Without hesitation, she fled, her heart racing for the safety of their cabin. Inside, her mother Martha was tending to the fire, and Cora's trembling voice relayed the unsettling encounter. Panic gripped them both as Martha rushed to the window, pulling the curtain closed with a heavy hand. Cora's voice quivered with anxiety as she suggested seeking refuge at Mr. Harrison's homestead. It was a desperate plea, born of a deep sense of unease and a primal instinct to protect her family. But the proposition hung in the air like a spectre, met with a complex blend of emotions from her mother. Martha, the bedrock of their family's resolve, had always been the voice of reason and fortitude. Her face, etched with the hardships of pioneer life, now bore the additional weight of worry and uncertainty. She considered Cora's proposal carefully, her gaze locked with her daughter's, their eyes reflecting shared fear and determination. The air inside the cabin felt heavy, charged with the tension of an impending decision. Cora's pulse quickened, and she anxiously awaited her mother's response, praying for a lifeline in this sea of uncertainty. With a sigh that seemed to release the weight of the world, Martha finally spoke, her voice strained yet resolute.
No, nightfall is upon us, and the risks of navigating the wilderness in darkness are too great. We'll leave at first light.
Cora nodded in reluctant agreement, her heart heavy with the knowledge that they had little choice but to wait out the ominous night within the confines of their cabin. The walls that had once offered comfort now felt like a prison, and the hours ahead stretched out before them like an endless abyss. In the dimly lit cabin, Martha retrieved a flintlock pistol, her hands steady despite the fear in her eyes. She handed it to Cora, who accepted it with reluctance. In the oppressive stillness, Martha's voice emerged, heavy with the weight of an unspeakable truth. Her words, like a sinister incantation, hung in the air, casting a pall over the room.
If they come for us,
She began, her voice barely louder than a whisper.
you must promise me, Cora. Use the pistol on yourself. It is better to face death than what they will do to you.
Cora's heart sank like a stone in the deep, dark waters of despair. The gravity of her mother's words hit her with a force she had never known. She had grown up in a world of harsh realities, but this was a realm of terror she had never contemplated. All she could manage in response was a trembling nod, her eyes wide with the stark terror of what might come to pass. Cora then turned and fixated herself on the window, her heart pounding, feeling the weight of their isolation. She longed for her father's presence, for her father's shield from the world's harshness. As the night deepened, Cora glanced over at her mother. Martha, the embodiment of maternal strength, sat vigil by the window, her eyes still locked on the moonlit world outside. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the flintlock pistol, a desperate guardian against the unknown. She had faced hardships and challenges in the wilderness, but even then, Cora could see the fear in her mother's eyes. Her heart thudded against her chest, each beat echoing the relentless march of time. The oppressive silence of the cabin amplified her fears, the creaking of the wooden walls and the distant hoot of an owl outside punctuating the dread that hung heavy in the air. In her despair, Cora dared to whisper her mother's name. Martha's gaze turned toward her, eyes haunted. Just then, a distant gunshot shattered the profound stillness that had settled within the cabin, jolting Cora and Martha from their shared apprehension. Both women turned as one, their eyes wide and searching, drawn to the windows like moths to a flame. The darkness beyond was impenetrable, and the moon's feeble light could not dispel the shadows that clung to the forest like malevolent specters.
Where did it come from?
Her mother asked, the question hanging in the air like a lifeline, as if piecing together the source of the danger might provide some semblance of control in their rapidly unraveling world. Cora strained her ears, her heart pounding like a frantic drum. The distant shots that followed seemed to echo from all directions, an enigma wrapped in the cloak of night. Musket fire, each one more piercing than the last, punctuated the night, echoing through the wilderness like a sinister symphony. Each gunshot cracked through the darkness like a sudden burst of light, momentarily casting an eerie illumination upon the dense woodline that encroached upon their property. Amidst the relentless symphony of musket fire and the tumultuous clash of battle, distant screams emerged like mournful wails, their haunting timbre threading through the cacophony. The night itself seemed to shudder at the sound, as if recoiling from the primal fear echoing through the darkness. Those anguished cries seared themselves into the minds of Cora and Martha alike. The night had suddenly been pierced by the symphony of conflict, reverberating on the very border of their world, tantalizingly close yet frustratingly beyond their reach. The ominous sounds of violence, of unseen forces clashing in the obscurity of the trees, sent shivers down Cora's spine. She and her mother exchanged glances, their eyes reflecting confusion and apprehension. In the hushed, shadowed confines of their cabin, they were left with only questions and a growing unease. Cora's grip on her musket tightened, her fingers trembling as she turned her gaze from the window to her mother. Her expression was a mix of determination and dread, a reflection of the relentless turmoil that churned within her. In the inky darkness, the cabin remained their sanctuary, just as it also became their prison. The minutes stretched into agonizing eternities, each gunshot and scream a stark reminder of their vulnerability. The twins clung to their mother, their small forms huddled together like frightened animals, their eyes wide with the terror of the unknown. Cora's voice trembled as she dared to voice the question that lingered in the air like a spectre.
Why haven't they attacked?
Martha, her unwavering gaze still locked on the woods beyond the window, provided a fragile reassurance in the face of their shared bewilderment.
Perhaps it's the British from the fort.
She mused.
They must have intercepted them.
As they looked on, time continued to march forward, each agonizing second stretching into a disorienting eternity. Gunshots and screams, which had once seemed like the relentless hammering of doom, eventually gave way to an eerie silence that descended upon the cabin like a stifling shroud. Bewilderment filled Cora and her mother, their initial relief giving way to a profound sense of disquiet. Martha, overcome with emotion yet fortified by her enduring faith, gathered her sons into her protective embrace, offering fervent thanks to God for sparing their lives thus far. In the hushed cabin, the twins clung to her like beacons of innocence in a world gone awry. But Cora, her anxiety still simmering beneath the surface, couldn't help but cast one more glance toward the window. The moonlight cast long, shifting shadows over the woods that bordered their homestead. In the play of light and dark, Cora's heart caught as she took notice of a pair of malevolent orange eyes staring back at her from within the wooded abyss. A gasp, born of instinctual fear, escaped her lips, and she promptly released her grip on the curtain. The chilling realization hung in the air. A sinister presence remained in the shadows, lurking and patient. Their ordeal was far from over, and the looming threat had merely bided its time, poised to descend upon them when the moment was most opportune, like a predator waiting to strike. As the long, treacherous hours passed, exhaustion settled upon Cora and her family like a heavy quilt. The dim light emitted by a single candle, perched nearby on a wooden table, cast wavering shadows that danced softly along the walls of their cabin. One by one, the twins, weary from the night's turmoil and lulled by the faint murmurs of exhaustion, succumbed to the soothing embrace of sleep. Their small forms lay curled beneath worn blankets, the picture of innocence amidst the chaos that had unfolded. Martha, the matriarch of their family, lingered at the window a moment longer, her eyes fixed on the moonlit world beyond. She lingered for a moment longer, and with a gentle sigh, she adjusted the blankets over her slumbering sons, tucking them in as if to shield them from the harsh realities that loomed just beyond their sanctuary. Exhausted from the relentless strain of the night's turmoil, Cora's mother finally relinquished her post by the window. Her body, worn and frayed from the ordeal, leaned back against the creaking chair, and it was not long before sleep's gentle embrace claimed her as well. However, for Cora, sleep remained an elusive spectre, a cruel companion that danced just beyond her reach. Her mind, a relentless torrent of thoughts and questions, raced like a wildfire. What had caused the gunfire that had shattered their peace? Who stopped the attack on their home? The unanswered questions gnawed at her, compelling her to seek answers beneath the veil of the night. Cora's gaze, now the only sentinel in the cabin, cautiously scanned the woodline once more. She couldn't shake the image of those malevolent orange eyes staring back at her from the shadows. Were they real, or had her mind betrayed her in the midst of fear and exhaustion? By now, a faint light from the coming dawn had begun to breach the horizon, painting the landscape from her window with a hazy, muted glow. A thin fog had settled over the field, the morning dew mixing with the chill of the night. The approaching morning seemed to unfold as though the ordeal of the night before had never happened, as if the horrors that had visited them had been nothing more than a fleeting nightmare. But as much as Cora struggled to brush aside her endless thoughts and curiosity, she found herself becoming increasingly consumed by the questions that lingered in her mind. There was no doubt that an attack on their lives had been imminent that night, but something had stopped their unseen assailants. And she needed to know why. The unanswered questions, like an irresistible enigma, tugged at her thoughts, compelling her to unravel the secrets that hid in the shadows. They had become an insatiable hunger in Cora's mind. It tugged at her thoughts like a relentless force, and one she couldn't ignore any longer. As the hours crept by, the weight of uncertainty pressed upon her, urging her to take action. The desire to unravel the mysteries of the night became unquenchable, a driving force that consumed her every thought and intention. At last, with unwavering determination and a heart heavy with resolve, Cora had made up her mind. With a stealthy grace, she slipped from her chair, careful not to rouse her family. The musket, her unwavering companion in this cruel world, found its place in her hands, a symbol of determination and protection. Its weight was a familiar comfort, a tangible reassurance that bolstered her resolve. Each footfall carried her closer to the cabin's door, each step echoing with the hushed urgency of her mission. As she cautiously eased the door shut behind her, the world outside greeted her with an eerie stillness, as though nature itself held its breath in anticipation of her journey into the unknown. Cora's senses, honed by years of survival, were heightened to an almost preternatural level. Every heartbeat and every breath seemed amplified, attuned to the stillness that enveloped her. The retreating moonlight cast elongated shadows that danced across the field, and she moved forward with the caution of a predator stalking its prey. Her steps, now leading her further from the safety of the cabin's warm embrace, carried her onward. Cora's vigilant eyes scanned the shadows for any subtle sign of danger. Every rustle of leaves and whisper of the morning wind scrutinized for hidden threats. As she drew nearer to the edge of the woods, uncertainty briefly gripped her. She glanced back at the homestead once more, her mother's stern visage and the potential fury of her absence weighing heavily on her mind. She knew the risks of her impulsive decision, the consequences of venturing into the perilous unknown. Cora carefully weighed her thoughts, her inner turmoil a testament to the conflict between duty and the insatiable pull of curiosity. But in the end, the magnetic force of the unanswered questions that had haunted her was far too great to resist. With a final resolve that steeled her heart, she turned her gaze back toward the beckoning woods and took her first steps beneath the veil of darkness, guided by the relentless need for answers that had become her driving force. Each step Cora took was deliberate, every footfall placed with a cautious precision as she ventured deeper into the heart of the woods. The dense canopy of ancient trees overhead shrouded her in a murky twilight, and the forest floor, blanketed with fallen leaves, betrayed her presence with the soft crunch of each careful step. She listened intently, her senses acutely attuned to the subtlest of sounds, the rustle of leaves, the whisper of the wind, and the distant hoot of an owl. An eerie silence had settled over the woods, a silence that seemed to hold its breath, as though the very trees were waiting for her to uncover their secrets. Cora's heart quickened with each passing moment, her pulse a steady drumbeat in the stillness. The dense undergrowth seemed to close in around her, the gnarled branches of trees forming a shadowy labyrinth that threatened to ensnare her. And then, as she rounded a bend in the forest path, her heart seemed to stop in its tracks. Her mouth fell open in shock, and she nearly lost her grip on the musket clutched tightly in her hands. She had stumbled upon a gruesome tableau that froze her in her tracks, a scene of horror etched into the very fabric of the woods. Before her lay a sight that defied all reason, a clearing marred by the macabre aftermath of a nightmarish ordeal. The ground was littered with signs of a violent struggle, the earth soaked with dark stains that could only be the lifeblood of those unfortunate souls caught in the throes of a merciless conflict. Cora's breath caught in her throat, her eyes transfixed by the ghastly sight before her. Broken branches and torn foliage bore witness to a desperate struggle, and discarded belongings lay scattered like silent witnesses to a tragedy that had unfolded in the heart of the woods. The musket in her trembling hands suddenly felt heavier, its presence a stark reminder of the dangers that lurked in the wilderness. Amidst the eerie stillness of the forest, a nightmarish scene unfolded before Cora's disbelieving eyes. Indian warriors, their faces twisted in agony, lay strewn across the ground, their lifeless bodies bearing the brutal marks of unspeakable violence. Dread coursed through her veins as she took in the gruesome aftermath of a struggle that had left its indelible mark on the woodland clearing. The fallen warriors were a haunting tableau of suffering, their once proud forms now reduced to pitiful remnants of humanity. Some lay dismembered, their limbs scattered amidst the carnage, a grotesque testament to the merciless brutality that had befallen them. As Cora surveyed the chilling scene, a deep sense of unease settled over her. Something was amiss. There were no signs of the British troops that her mother had suggested may have intercepted their assailants. Instead, the carnage bore the hallmarks of a different kind of violence, one that defied explanation. The musket remained steady in Cora's trembling grasp as she advanced further into the grim tapestry before her. Each step brought her closer to the heart of the mystery, and her every sense was on high alert. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if awaiting her next move. In the midst of her cautious exploration, her foot collided with a lifeless form, and she tumbled to the ground with a gasp of horror. The forest floor, damp and chilling, cradled her fall as she struggled to regain her composure. As she scrambled to her feet, her gaze was drawn to one of the fallen warriors. His vacant eyes seemed to bore into her very soul, a haunting stare that sent a shiver down her spine. In those lifeless orbs, she saw not only the reflection of the brutality that had unfolded, but also a silent plea for understanding, a chilling reminder of the profound enigma that now consumed her. Just as Cora prepared to flee the nightmarish terrain, a soft, labored breath reached her ears. She froze, her heart quickening its tempo, and turned toward the source of the sound. In the shadows, concealed by the underbrush, lay an injured man. His features remained shrouded by the obscurity of night, his breaths shallow and pained, as used what strength he had to look at her with plea in his eyes. Curiosity and compassion overcame Cora's initial shock, and she approached the wounded stranger, musket held at the ready should danger arise. Cora knelt beside the injured young man, her breaths shallow, her heart heavy with compassion. His presence spoke of suffering and vulnerability, his strong features conflicting with his weakened state. The stranger's labored breaths echoed in the silence, each one a testament to his pain. She lowered her musket, realizing that this man, regardless of his origins, was in dire need of help. With gentle movements, Cora reached out to inspect the stranger's injuries, her fingers trembling as they brushed against his clothing. His breathing grew shallower, and it was evident that time was of the essence. She considered for a moment, leaving the man where he laid as she recalled the reason for his plight, but as she continued to look at him, her pity for his state grew ever more. Carefully, she searched her surroundings, her eyes scanning the dark expanse for any sign of danger once more. But the forest remained shrouded in silence, as if it seemed to offer a fragile truce. Cora hesitated, torn between her desire to aid the wounded man and her instinct to protect her family. Her mother, the twins. What would they say if they discovered her actions? But as she glanced back in the direction of the cabin, a haunting realization washed over her. Her family lay shrouded in slumber, blissfully unaware of the horrors she'd witnessed in the night. They needed her protection, but so did the injured stranger, left to the mercy of an unforgiving world. Determination ignited within Cora's heart. She couldn't leave him here to perish. With a firm resolve, she leaned closer to the stranger, her voice a whisper in the stillness.
Hold on.
She urged, her words a promise. Gently, she eased the man's wounded form onto her shoulder, surprised by his unexpected weight. With painstaking care, she began the arduous journey back to the cabin, her steps cautious and deliberate as he leaned over her small frame. Every rustle of leaves, every distant sound became a potential threat, and Cora's senses remained heightened. As they approached the cabin, the candle's glow still faintly visible through the window, her heart raced with trepidation. She prayed that her actions wouldn't endanger her family, that they would understand the choice she had made in the woods. With each step, Cora's burden grew heavier, but her determination never wavered. The night had revealed its secrets to her, and she carried them, along with the wounded stranger, into the uncertain future. As Cora gently pushed open the cabin door, the weathered wood creaked with a mournful protest, jolting her mother, Martha, from the uneasy depths of her sleep. The woman's eyes snapped open, and for a brief moment, confusion clouded her gaze as she tried to make sense of the intrusion. Martha's initial reaction was one of irritation, her anger simmering just beneath the surface in the wake of Cora's unexpected plea. Her gaze shifted swiftly from her daughter to the wounded stranger leaning heavily over her shoulder, and her brows knitted together in a mixture of disbelief and exasperation. Cora, trembling with a mix of fear and determination, felt compelled to explain what she had witnessed in the depths of the night.
Mother,
She began, her voice softer now, but filled with the weight of undeniable truth.
I saw them, the natives. It was unlike anything I've ever seen. They were savaged, Mother, mangled. It wasn't human.
The words hung in the air, their implications sinking in as Martha grappled with the gravity of her daughter's account. The room seemed to grow colder, the very air weighted with the enormity of the situation.
And so you brought one of them here, into our home.
Martha struggled to keep her voice hushed so as not to rouse the sleeping boys. Her words were sharp, edged with exasperation and anger.
Cora, you foolish child.
But as she gazed over her daughter and the man's grievous condition, a shift occurred within Martha. The initial anger and reproach began to wane, replaced by a begrudging understanding of the necessity that had driven Cora to such a perilous act. Her eyes softened briefly, revealing a vulnerability that she rarely displayed. With a heavy sigh, her mother took her place beside the injured stranger, and the two women carefully guided him to a bed nearby. Cora could still feel the palpable weight of her mother's anger, but now it was tempered by a reluctant acceptance of the circumstances. Despite her lingering frustration, Martha spoke in a curt tone, her words intended to console her daughter in this distressing moment.
It must have been a large bear.
She reasoned, her voice tinged with desperation.
A bear sent by the Almighty to protect us. Divine intervention.
Cora nodded, her faith in her mother's words a fragile anchor in the midst of turmoil. She wanted desperately to believe that this inexplicable violence could be explained away by divine providence, though the images of the savage scene she had witnessed continued to haunt her thoughts.
Yes, Mother.
She agreed, her voice carrying the weight of uncertainty. Martha, her resolve returning, offered a plan to address the gruesome aftermath.
I'll go out and see it for myself.
She declared, her voice now firm and unyielding.
And fetch our neighbour, Mr. Turner, to help with the bodies. In the meantime, you may tend to his wounds.
As Cora nodded in gratitude, her mother turned away from the wounded stranger and rose to her feet, her movements marked by determination and a sense of duty.
He can stay long enough until he is recovered and not a moment longer.
Martha muttered to herself, her words laced with a weary resignation.
God has spared us, even if it means showing compassion to those who would not have shown it to us.
Her mother's reluctant acceptance of the wounded stranger into their home had brought a temporary reprieve from anger and blame, but it hadn't extinguished the embers of remorse that burned within Cora's conscience. Her thoughts suddenly consumed by the weight of her actions. As she lowered her head, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had jeopardized her family's safety by bringing the injured man into their sanctuary. Her decision, born from compassion and a thirst for answers, now seemed like an unforgivable gamble in the face of an unknown threat. With their roles now defined, Cora's mother headed outside to confront the grim reality that awaited her. And Cora, returning her gaze to the wounded man, her hands cautiously tending to his injuries, couldn't help but ponder the enigmatic stranger who had disrupted the fabric of their lives. As Cora diligently tended to the stranger's wounds, he began to mutter words in his native tongue, a language entirely foreign to her ears. She strained to understand, but the majority of his utterances remained an impenetrable mystery. One word, however, he repeated with an almost desperate urgency, a word that hung in the air like an unanswered question as he looked deeply into her eyes until he succumbed to unconsciousness. Hours passed, the daylight filtering through the cabin's modest window, and the injured man's condition remained unchanged. As he lay in the bed, Cora mused over his features, her thoughts torn between curiosity and apprehension. She had heard rumors of the native people who inhabited these woods, tales that painted them as elusive and enigmatic figures. their reputation often more threat than reality. Yet here was one of them, lying unconscious in her bed. His features were sharp and finely etched, a stark contrast to the tumultuous events that had unfolded. In a time when Cora longed for social interaction beyond the confines of her family, the one stranger who had sparked her curiosity lay silent and vulnerable before her. Hours later, her mother, Martha, returned, her face etched with horror, confirming what Cora had seen in those early morning hours. Without a word, she resumed her chores, the weight of the day's secrets heavy upon her shoulders. And in the quiet moments when she stole a glance at the injured stranger, his presence served as a constant reminder of the risks she had taken. The mystery that surrounded him, his people, and the violent encounter in the woods left her with more questions than answers. Their lives had changed irrevocably, and as they faced the challenges that lay ahead, they clung to the fragile hope that God and His divine intervention had indeed spared them from an even darker fate.
Tune in next week for Part 2 of Settler's Dread. As we close this chapter with the curious Scriptorium, don't forget to like and subscribe for more intriguing tales. Thanks for joining us, and until we meet again, stay curious.